Good morning, Simon, and how are you today?
I'm very well, thanks. I'm just those that have been around for a second know that we're having a couple of video problems, and somebody, I don't know who, has just said the man has a face for radio. Excellent. My video feed keeps disappearing. Thank you very much for that. But you're right.
Not a problem.
I'm okay. I'm doing well, Cindy. How you doing? How are you?
A great start to presentations by having presentations with playing up.
Always a good plan. Always a good plan.
Absolutely, absolutely. Right. So today we're talking about the Presentation Waltz, basically 3 steps to presentation heaven, but that title's far too long. So this is kind of a bit of a carry on from before. Can you sort of like just bring us in why? Okay. And
the reason we call it a waltz is because there's 3 steps. It's a cheap pun. That's all. It's just an easy way for us to remember it. And a long time ago, I learned to waltz just as a surprise to my wife, and all I can remember about it is that it's just got 3 steps. It's left, right, together, right, left, together, left. So it's the easiest dance on the face of the planet. So that's why we call it the Presentation Waltz. But it's just a shorthand to help us remember how to make our presentations not suck. It's as simple as that, really. And it's a way of structuring the way you approach your design. And to be honest, the steps apply for any communication, but we particularly apply them to presentations. And those steps are what we call physical, intellectual, and emotional. Now, pedantically, the jargon calls that contextual, but we're going to call it emotional, and you'll see why in a second. Apart from anything else, it gives you a nice acronym, that PIE thing, just makes it a lot easier.
Pi.
Yeah,
so it's
exactly.
Pi thinking.
Pi thinking. It's easier to remember pi than it is to remember pick. We thought pick wasn't necessarily good. So PIE, physical, intellectual, and contextual. And if you get those 3 things sorted out, your presentations don't suck. And just define my terms really simply. Physical is straightforward. That's if you can't see me and you can't, that's tempting fate, isn't it, given the Wi-Fi connections we're having. If you can't see me and you can't hear me, there can be no communication. It's as simple as that, okay? But people think of that as a black and white thing. They think either there is communication or there isn't. And that's not true, because if you're spending mental energy at the kind of the physical level of interaction, trying to figure out what somebody is saying, trying to understand their jargon, trying to understand their language, trying to read what the slides say when the slides are written in 12-point Times New Roman, and that, you've got less brain space left to get to anything else. So the physical stuff is the stuff that, to be honest, anybody except a novice speaker should be getting right. It should be just pretty straightforward. It's things like, what font do you use? What size of font do you use? Do you need a microphone? How slowly do you speak? Are the colors on your slides okay so that people can see, because we've all seen slides. Colors on slides, yes. It's shocking, shocking. But you've all seen slides where people have used the corporate template. And the corporate template has been designed by a moron, and it's designed to look good when you print it on the front of a logo thing. And it's my favorite one that I've just seen this week is purple on turquoise. And the downside of that is that nobody can read. But yeah, it's hideous. And you just can't read it, because the differentiation between the text and the background isn't sufficient. So it's for that. Color schemes, making sure that people who are that have difficulty reading things can read them. People with that are colorblind can read them, and all that kind of stuff. So that's the physical level of interaction. If you get that wrong, everything else is a waste of time. It's pretty straightforward.
So as you're saying that our brain is so much engaged with what if most people would call the small stuff, that actually all that combined can have a real big impact.
Yeah, it increases your cognitive load, so that there's a bit of jargon for you. It increases your audience's cognitive load so that they can't spend as much of their brain space concentrating on what it is that you are going to say. Okay, so a really silly example we've got now. I'm hoping that my video feed is still working, but suppose my video feed fades in and fades out and it's static and it starts to irritate people. There's not a lot I can do about it, if you see what I mean. But it will mean that people will find it more difficult to listen to the actual content of what I'm saying.
Right, because they're more agitated by when you're going to fade out and when you're going to fade back in.
Yeah. Or maybe that my microphone isn't picking me up properly. All of that kind of stuff. There's also technical details, and to be honest, the way we get past those is It's an embarrassingly simple tool that we call it ties and flies, but that's just an in-joke in the company. It's it's a checklist. It's as simple as that. It is literally a checklist. All the things that could go wrong before a presentation, we sit down, we go through a checklist. Have you checked this? Tick. Have you checked that? Tick. Have you checked the other? Tick. Have they, are the slides okay? Can you see them from the back of the room? Does my PowerPoint work? Yada, yada, yada. All the things that, kind of common sense stuff. But the reason we do it on a checklist is because in the heat of the moment, it's very easy to forget things.
Well, I was going to ask you, is there like a definitive kind of checklist? Because there are so many people out there that's talking about presentations. They're talking about that death by PowerPoint, or how to avoid death by PowerPoint. Right.
Long story short, no, there's no definitive list. We have 3 for different types of presentation. And we sat down. Let's pretend we had a team meeting. Let's pretend it was a proper team meeting as opposed to pizza and red wine. Okay, let's pretend it was a full-on team meeting. And we just had a conversation amongst ourselves about all the things that could possibly go wrong and how nervous they were. Wrote them all down on a checklist, typed it up, printed it up. Actually, we've got some laminated as well. And then before a gig goes live, literally just go tick, 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 to make sure that all the physical things that could go wrong are as covered as we can get them. Things will go wrong. Life's like that. But you just have to, you do the best you can. And it has loads of other advantages too. The first is that not only did it make sure that nothing is going to go wrong technically, but it does a lot for your nerves too. Knowing that all the technical stuff has been taken care of makes people a lot more confident. And the third advantage we find, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, so in other words, by having that checklist, then the only things that can go wrong are just those things beyond your control that you have no idea.
Absolutely. And we find the third advantage, of course, is just the ritual of sitting down together for 5 minutes before you go on stage, going through the same ritual again and again and again. We find that or at least I find that quite calming. I don't know whether the others do, but I find it quite calming. So the physical stuff, that's it. That's the first step. That's your left foot forward in the waltz type thing. It's as easy as it gets. And if you've got that right, or at least if you've got that right enough, that means that your audience then gets the next stage, which is the intellectual stage, which is where they get it here. They understand what it is that you're saying. You've made some kind of logical statement and they understand it.
Okay, so in other words, you're saying that without the physical stuff going on, it's not then inhibiting on the brain process to actually understand what it is they are trying to process.
Yeah, absolutely. So
the fuzzy stuff.
The jargon we use is the physical stuff wants to be transparent. It wants to be so good and so slick that it doesn't look like it's there, if you see what I mean. So you get straight down to the intellectual stuff. And the intellectual stuff is when you explain things to your audience in a way that they can get. And that's largely to do with things like cognitive load. That's to do with not using jargon, such as cognitive load, for starters. It's about breaking things down into bite-sized chunks. It's about explaining things to the audience without using jargon. It's about simplifying to the point where it's as simple as it can get, but not patronizing them. It's about doing the obvious things like having black slides between different chapters. So you've got you finish a section, you have a black slide which lets the audience's brains reset, and then you move on. It's about obvious, simple things like refreshing, recapturing, using the right medium, that kind of stuff. Going back to the waltz thing, for example, when I was taught to waltz, there was no PowerPoint involved because that was that would have been a dumb medium for me to learn to waltz. It was Amanda physically got hold of me and said, no, this foot, you idiot, that foot, together. So that was the way. So it's all about making sure the obvious things like no jargon and you're using the right medium. That's what I'm sorry, my brain went to sleep there. The right medium and all of that kind of stuff. And to be honest, that's the point where most people's presentations stop. They explain things to people, and they expect, and they kind of naively hope and pretend to themselves that we are smart, intelligent, grown-up human beings. And if you give people logical arguments, people will go, "Oh yeah, that's right," and they will change their behaviour. Well,
right. So basically, also then using those black slides help to, it's like a physical pause, because I know when we're speaking, we have to train in pauses during our presentation to give the brains time to process. But also by putting the black size on the blacks on the presentations as well, that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. It's when you're reading a book, for example, at the end of a chapter, there is a blank page, and you know that what comes next after that is a change of person, location, or time. In other words, it gives your mind a kind of a restart. So lots of little things like that comprise the intellectual level of communication. That's how you kind of minimize the amount of brain space the audience amount of work the audience's brains are having to do.
Okay, well, that would then bring in very, very nicely, because the amount of the brain is working, and you've taken into account all the physical stuff, and with using the PowerPoint. Now we've got a question in from Lee.
Hello, Lee.
That's the name, right? How do you make your presentation on PowerPoint that is not being too full of acronyms? Because obviously using acronyms is also taking brain power.
Absolutely.
Like Pi, trying to busily remember what they stand
absolutely. And acronyms and things are the bane of my life. There is a shed load of research. There's a shed load of research that looks at jargon, in fact, and acronyms are just a form of jargon. And when you ask people why they're using jargon, they will tell you it's because it makes the communication faster and more efficient and more precise.
Okay.
And there's an element of that. It does speed up communication if you're talking to other people, and only to other people who have exactly the same acronyms, the same jargon. But psychologists and psychiatrists look at this, and they tell us very clearly that the main reason that people use acronyms and jargon is because it sets up a me clever, you stupid kind of. That's what it does. Right? I'm clever because I'm using acronyms. What did you do at work today, Simon? I made glove puppets on screen. I'm clever, and I don't know the acronym, therefore I'm stupid. And it's designed by these people to make themselves look smart. Okay, that's what it's there for. I tell a story all the time where I took my younger daughter once to the doctor, and I said to him, she's got a rash around the mouth. And he spent 10 minutes examining my little girl. She was 3 at the time. He spent 10 minutes examining my daughter, and then he turned to me and said, well, Mr. Raybould, I can confirm that your daughter has perioral dermatitis. All right, okay. You unpack that, peri, around, oral, the mouth, dermatitis, a skin rash, right? So he has taken 10 minutes to translate she's got a rash around the mouth into the Latin for she's got a rash around the mouth. And he thought that was a diagnosis. Well done, doctor. But what he's doing is basically trying to do that so that it gives him some kind of authority, some kind of credibility. It didn't work because at the time I was lecturing at medical schools. I was lecturing people like him, and I knew what he was doing. But that's why it's done. That's why people use jargon and stuff. And to answer the question, sorry, Lee, I've gone way off off topic. To answer the question, the only way I've ever found of doing it is to give your presentation to somebody who doesn't know what you're talking about, and every time you use an acronym or jargon, get them to put their hand up. The problem with using jargon is that it's so far wrapped into our own way of thinking, we don't notice when we're using it. Find a friend, find a child, find a stranger, find somebody who doesn't have a clue what you're talking about, and when you rehearse your presentation, rehearse it to them and get them to stick their hand up every time there is an acronym or a bit of jargon that they don't recognize. Or frankly, just give them a taser. Right? Every time.
That will soon stop you. But then that actually also stops you falling into yes, and the trouble is though, they might actually start finding more fun thinking that's nearly jargon, that's good enough.
Okay.
Right.
But yes, it depends on you've got to trust your friends to do that, of course. But to be honest, it's the only way really, because by definition you're not going to notice your own jargon because it's inside your own psyche, and you need someone to come at it from the outside. So sorry, Lee, the only answer I've got for you is to rehearse it with a stranger. The good news is you should be rehearsing your presentations anyway. So at least I like the latter. Clearly a violent woman of my own heart wanting to use tasers and things.
But then actually by getting somebody else to do that jargon buster, and it's a very good idea actually, because I fell foul of talking to a client once when we were talking about CRM. And it was back in the days when CRM was a new jargon buzz phrase acronym. And that's when I started learning that CRM actually meant to some clients customer relation management, others it was customer retention, marketing. which is totally different to management when you're trying to market to them.
I will see that horror story and raise you.
Okay.
Okay, so what anybody watching this needs to know is that I'm just going to be slightly tasteless for about 2 minutes, so brace yourselves, okay? I was doing a presentation to a whole bunch of doctors, and I talked about peripheral vision. That's the stuff you can see out of the corner of your eye.
Yeah, that bit that we talked
about. Yeah. And I abbreviated the PV, because peripheral vision is quite hard to say. So I abbreviated it to PV. Yep. Now, unfortunately, to doctors, that means perivaginal.
Oh, no.
Yeah, bit of a car crash moment at that point. So it all went horribly wrong for about 5 minutes at that point. So jargon, it can be hugely difficult.
So in other words, just stick away from them.
Yeah, it's. But if I'd said peripheral vision all the time, I wouldn't have had that problem. So it is a real problem, and it's anything that makes the audience think harder about the way you're saying it means that they've got less brain space left to think about what you're saying.
So it's going back to the physical stuff again, which is becoming, so it's when the saying starts becoming part of that fuzzy stuff.
And that's not just true of the physical, it's also true of the intellectual. So jargon would be a great example of when they're having to spend brain power translating your jargon into proper English. And they're thinking about the way you're saying it rather than what you're saying.
Now, wouldn't that also translate when they're using big, long words like anti-establishmentarianism? You know,
anti-parliamentary disestablishmentarianism. Yeah, absolutely. Just don't do it twice. We're fine. Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the problems with people who write their presentation and write their scripts, because they write in a style of English that nobody speaks. Now, I'm going to stick my tongue firmly in my cheek, so don't take this too seriously. But with my tongue in my cheek, we tend to write in Latin and speak in Saxon. So you might say, for example, when you're writing, you would say the commencement of the project. Well, no one would actually say that. You might write it, but you would never say that. When you're saying it, you'd say at the beginning, which is
once upon a time.
Yeah, once upon a time. It's much more based upon the words that have come into our language via the Saxon route, rather than those that come in via the Latin route. Now, don't take me too literally on that. There's a lot of very, very blurry lines around there, but it's just a useful way of thinking about it. So if you're trying to design your presentation, we strongly recommend that people design their presentations out loud to avoid the Latin problem. Some have seen today what professions are all about and pompous. Yeah, I'm not about that. I'm about making my audience understand what it is that I'm saying. And anybody who's using long Latin words for the sake of using long Latin words, I'd better hope I don't have a sniper rifle in the audience, because at that point I will shorten the presentation quite a lot.
So you're going to be the word heckler, aren't you? What exactly does that mean? Because that's one thing I have found with some people. They use long words, Latin phrases, etc., to try and make themselves look better and more intellectual than what they are. Yeah. Until somebody actually asks them a question, and that's when they all fall apart.
Again, there's a shed load of research, even amongst academics, who you would think would be the worst people for long words and things. There is a shed load of research that suggests that if you write clearly and in short sentences, people A, understand it more, and B, think you're smarter. Now, that's not what we tend to assume. We tend to assume that long, convoluted words are the way forward. But actually, short words are the way forward. Yes,
which comes back down to short words allows for the intellect to pick it up quicker and faster. It's defuzzing it.
Yeah, people, they've got more of their brain space on your content and less of their brain dedicated on translating your obscure words and things into accessible English. Right. And the whole thing about the intellectual level of understanding is that you want to make it as clear as you can, but you don't want to stop there. That's the tricky bit, because nobody ever changes their behavior just because you've made a compelling argument. I mean, let me give you an example, okay? So you don't smoke. So you don't smoke, do you?
I don't know.
No. Okay. A lot of people do. Last figures I looked at suggest that 27% of the population smoked, and it's.
I'm a sugar addict. Does that help?
Sorry?
I'm a sugar addict.
Okay, sugar addict. Let's take sugar.
Chocoholic.
Right. You know that sugar is bad for you. You know that eating too much sugar is going to make you fat and unhealthy and shorten your life. Great. Okay. Yeah. but you still eat too much sugar.
Yep.
There's a difference between knowing it and acting on it. So, as a society, all of us know that smoking is bad for us, and as a society, we don't exercise enough. We drink too much red wine. We drink too much altogether. Too much red wine. We eat too much meat, a lot too much red meat, and all of that kind of stuff. And yet we still do it. We don't exercise enough. We know we should go to the gym. Well, it's a bar humbug just because I'm not saying you don't eat it. I'm just saying it's going to kill you, right? It's a trade-off. Right?
It is hereditary.
Be aware of the fact that you can eat chocolate and die young. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying be aware of it. But the point is that nobody ever changes their behavior, let's say about smoking, because they know it's going to kill them. It's not until it hits their emotion.
The actual medical stuff, yes.
That's the point when they go, it changes from, oh, good Lord, this might kill me, to, oh my God, this is going to kill me.
So that's where the emotional link comes in, I guess.
Exactly. So
you led that very well.
Physical is what you need to get through in the first place, down to the intellectual. And then having made an intellectual argument, you need to make some kind of contextual or emotional link so that the audience engages with what you're saying, because it turns out that they're much more likely to remember it and act upon it if they've kind of made an emotional connection with it. So those 3 steps, that's the waltz. The presentation waltz, it's physical, intellectual, and emotional.
Right. Now that emotional part, though, is quite hard to do, because I hear it time and time again from a lot of the speakers saying, if you can make the emotional link, you've got them. Yeah,
and it's tricky, isn't it? Okay,
it's very tricky.
Okay, we have a number of ways. We call it the action barrier. The gap between intellectual and emotional. That's the action barrier between those 2 things, right? And the number of ways to get across that action barrier. I should have just scribbled on the wall behind me, but I'm in a borrowed office, so I don't want to put a Sharpie on the sage's walls. Right?
I don't know. You're out of the room by 12, so you can scarf.
Fine, that's it. I'll just scribble the walls and run like hell. The thing is, they know who I am. That's the problem. There are a number of ways to get across that barrier, and the second best way is stories. Okay, you tell your audience stories, some kind of anecdote that they emotionally connect with. Okay, because we are designed neurologically to learn things by stories. I mean, ask yourself, right? I'm assuming that at some point, Cindy, somebody tucked you up in bed and read your bedtime stories.
Oh, yes.
A long time ago, perhaps, right? But probably, let's stereotypically, it would be your mum, right? But somebody. Did they sit you down, tuck you into bed, and say to you, I now have a bullet point checklist of how to be a brave person. Bullet point 1, run towards the sound of gunfire. Tick. Bullet point 2, do not run away. Tick. No, they didn't, right? What they did was they told you a story in which the hero, and I'm sorry, it is usually a hero, is brave, and you identify with that hero, and that is how you learn to be brave. Right? That's how we are designed to learn. So stories are a fantastic way of getting across that action threshold, that action barrier, if you like. But I said that was the second best way. The reason it's the second best way is that the best way is to get your audience to give you their stories. Because it's a story and they'll learn from it, but they're much more likely to trust each other's stories than they are to trust your stories.
But how can you get somebody, it's very hard that when you're actually giving a big presentation to a big audience to actually get that kind of level of engagement from an audience member who's going to actually share a story like that.
And that's why the very first thing the thing I studied you first was the second best one was tell your stories. I didn't go in with get their stories because that's the hardest one to do. But a sneak cheat is to ask them questions, open-ended questions if you can, such as, well, let's pretend I'm in front of an audience. So you say to them, okay, by show of hands, who came in by bus this morning? Crowded, weren't they? And what you've done is set them going in their heads to think of the journey that they had into work. You've got some kind of story. You haven't actually got them to tell you that story, but at least you have created that story in their heads as they replay their journey to work. And
by you saying crowded, weren't they, in a very simple way, you kind of got across the message that you too travelled in by bus.
Yeah.
Because you was one of them.
Yeah, and I've used that as a silly example because that kind of breaks the ice. But then you start doing a whole bunch of other stuff about there's much more to do with the topic that you're talking about. So you can use the same technique. You can ask them questions to get them thinking of stories in your head. Quizzes and anything like that gets them to create stories in their head.
Right. So that's basically what Lee was saying. Is that because it can make the connection between their story and your own story?
Yep. Yeah. But it's also to do with something called backstory. Let me get some more jargon in here, because I think I've been too understandable for too long. So let me throw you some jargon in here. Backstory. Backstory is the jargon term we use for the work that the audience does in their heads in order to make the emotional engagement with what you're saying. Mm-hmm. A really silly example, okay? One of my team is called Claire. I love her to pieces. She's an English Lit graduate, and we have a continuing argument about who is the greatest writer in the English language. Okay, now,
the writer, yeah.
Okay, so she's wrong. It's Shakespeare. And one of these days, her annual review is going to be predicated upon her admitting that I'm right. Damn it! But
who does she say?
She says it's Steinbeck.
Who?
Steinbeck. Now,
who?
He's famous for a short story of only 3 words. Six words. Six words, I'm sorry. And those 6 words are for sale, baby shoes, never used.
Oh.
Yeah, okay, there's the reaction, you see. Now, those 6 words, never worn, never used, those 6 words are not a story. Those, if you think about it, those words, that's an advert that you would see in a newsagent's window or something. The story, and I'm pointing at the screen here, and I'm pointing at you on the screen. So the story is what you have created in your head to explain what I've just said. Does that make sense?
I will say, from my viewpoint, that's a very misleading information, because for me, having children, I would automatically assume that there was going to be. Mm-hmm. Prior to me to having children, I would have gone, okay, now if it's a male also telling me they've got, I would assume that he's just selling them, doesn't matter, right. Okay. But if it'd been a female who said that, so for me, there's a lot of other things going on.
Oh, sure, yeah, absolutely.
Whereas Shakespeare or anything like that, where it's clearly defined, it's sort of like it's taking you on a journey, and there's more of the information.
Don't get me wrong. I'm just using that as a teaching example. But
no.
You raise a good point, though, because there is something called, well, for the sake of simplicity, let's just call it the offence threshold. Okay. Now, I would contend that people remember things, and the more likely to remember things, the closer you are to that threshold. The more emotional response they are having, the more likely they're to remember things. But there will come a point where you do that.
Where they cross it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And as soon as you do that, you lose people. And for example, if I'm working on stage, a lot of my stories are about my kids. Mm-hmm. Huge numbers of my stories are about my kids when I'm on stage. That's because my kids they're just the kind of people who create stories. They're very easy people to talk about, because they're your stories and not copy stories. All I have to do is get my kids' permission, and away you go, right? and the way to get the kids' permission is to simply say, "Could I use that story, darling? Or would you not like any Christmas presents this year?" That's definitely
very emotional.
Because that's pretty good, because lots of people have got kids. Everybody has been a kid. But here's the threshold, right? Here's my stories about my kids. But what happens if I'm talking to an audience where somebody is estranged from their kids, or their child has died, or their kid is ill or something? Straight away, the stress threshold goes over there, right? And at that point, I lose that member of the audience altogether, because they're too busy worrying about their kids and things. So I always I always suggest to people that you figure out how important this thing is that you're talking about, and you pitch your stories accordingly. Right. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah. So that's basically also when I think that I know somebody quite well, and you go in and you're listening to them chat to some other friends, and suddenly they start using a language or talking in a way that is not what you think is them, because they've just taken it up next level to who they're talking to.
Yeah, people talk to different people in different ways all the time. If you see me with my really intimate friends, we never actually finish sentences. We sometimes don't even finish words, because we understand what's not being said. A raised eyebrow translates as "What would you like to drink?" It's that kind of conversation. It's the answer, and raised eyebrow for me is large white wine. Pinot for breakfast. It's that kind of thing. But I always suggest to people that when they design their presentations and they design their stories, they do, for lack of a better term, they do a risk assessment on every story. And I know that sounds massively pretentious and over the top,
Risk
But
assessment.
just a risk assessment. Is this story going to tip people over the offence threshold?
Okay, but then that's coming back down to actually knowing your audience and what physically distracts them.
Yep. And what emotionally distracts them, and all of that kind of jazz. And you kind of, my advice to people is you want to be working. Now, this is advice and experience rather than science. But my advice is you want to be somewhere around the 80% threshold, because that gives you a margin for error.
Okay. How would you work out what that experience is, though, or that threshold?
You know what I'm going to say to this one. It's experience, and it's going into the audience, and it's figuring out what the audience are, and it's testing it at the first 3 minutes of your presentation are there, and if they laugh, you can push it to there, and if they don't, you have to pull it back. But to be honest, you can always make some kind of guess before you go in there. Let's face it. I'm going in to speak to a bunch of accountants.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, this is probably down there. Now that's a massive generalization, a huge generalization. But what I do is I expect them to be low. So I hit here, and if that's working, then I'll push it a bit, and I'll push it a bit, and I'll push it. I won't start here.
Okay.
Right? Because I can't come back.
But if you went to stock traders, for example, you could start at the top there, really.
Probably. I wouldn't want to assume that, because it's always safer to play it and go up. But in principle, yeah. In principle. So what you do is, for every point you want to make, you have a couple of different stories in the back of your mind, and which story you choose to use on the day depends upon the reaction that you're getting from the audience from your previous work. Does that make any sense? It makes it harder work. Yeah?
Yep. I think you're making sense. No, I think you made very good points about with the physical, intellectual, and emotional, because when I talk to most people about presentations and how you build it, they go into first of all, you need to tell them what you're going to tell them. They go that route rather than what you've done, which is you've actually put the bones behind everything of that, which makes it...
The tell them what you're going to tell them thing, our version of that is tell them how you're going to bore them, tell them how you bored them. Just does my head in, right? Really does my head in. But just to finish off before I forget, sorry, Cindy, but otherwise I'll forget about it. I said there was the number of ways you can get across the action barrier. So I've said your stories, their stories. The third way across there is images, because an image is just a visual shorthand for a story. Mm-hmm. So we have a very famous slide that I put up most of the time in my presentations and my training, and I'm so confident this slide works that I say to people about 10 o'clock on a training course, at 4:30 when you finish and I ask you what slides I've shown you this morning, if you don't remember this slide, the training's free. That's how confident we are of this slide, right? It's a really visually impactful slide, and it's a photograph. It's a slide that shows a NASA astronaut over here and the Earth over there. Right? But that NASA astronaut didn't suddenly come into view, didn't exist, be photographed and disappear. That astronaut has a whole story behind them, then they were photographed, and then there's the rest of their life going on. So an image is just a whole story just captured at a key point in its time. You can think of stories as visual as images as visual shorthands for stories.
Okay, but then isn't that more for, for example, the Japanese, Chinese, they're very famous for setting the photo up to tell the story, as opposed to now the more Western modern thing of doing selfie, where it's just you and the photo. But in actual fact, when you look back at it years later, they're not going to know what time period that was and the backstory to that. Okay.
The short answer to that question is that every presentation is different. And there's no universal answer I can give to that, because if you're trying to create this PIE thing with your audience, by definition, it's your audience is always going to be different every time. Your topic is going to be different. Your room is going to be different, and all of that kind of jazz. If I was doing this live, I would have done it in a different way to the way I'm doing it now. If you see what I mean. So it's a question of judging your audience, judging your content, judging your venue, and making decisions based upon that as to what kind of images and all of that kind that you show.
So I know Lee's made the point of saying that not all pictures tell stories, especially the selfies. By what you're saying is there might be a time But you can say, well, actually, the selfie will tell what mood that person is in.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that you should use any old image. I'm saying that there are
the right image for the right point to tell the story of what you're trying to do.
Exactly. You figure out what do I know, what do they need to know, what image is going to get them across that gap between the two. Right?
Okay.
But it's not any old image, and I disagree. By the way, I think that selfies do tell a story. What the story they tell is that the person taking the selfie is a self-obsessed narcissist. And I can just watch every logging off now as they go, I've taken selfies, they're rude to me.
No, we're having intellectual.
Anyway,
that brings in very nicely a very good question from Ken, actually.
Okay. You see it. I see it. Okay.
What do you think of the
presentations? I'm a fan of TED. Not all TED talks are great, but a lot of them are. And the reason that they work for me is because I tell you what, as far as I'm aware, one of the most downloaded TED talks ever is Simon Sinek's Start from Why. You know the why, how, what concentric circles thing? And that is, if you look at it and watch it, that works perfectly with this PIE thing that I'm talking about, because he opens up with, he doesn't just give you information, he opens up with questions, which are things like, why do you get out of bed in the morning? Why should anybody care? Why is it that Martin Luther King became the head of the American Civil Rights Movement when other people were better orators? Why is it the Wright brothers invented control-powered manned flight when they had no money and they weren't the smartest group? So you start getting those kind of questions asked to make the emotional connection, and then he gives you the intellectual answer. So the short answer is, I like them because most of them are very well structured. There are the occasional ones which just wander off onto Planet Zog or something, but most of them are very well structured. And I always make a joke of saying to people that if they've not come across a TED website, they shouldn't go to look at the TED website unless they have 2 days of their life to lose. Because you watch this video and you go, oh, that was cool. And if you like that, you'll like this. So you watch that one, and then you watch this one, and this one, and this one, and this one, and this one. And then hours later, you're thinking, "Oh, I'm quite hungry. Why is that?" Yes, because you've forgotten to eat because you're watching all these little 18-minute TEDs. The thing that I am a little concerned about with the TED stuff, and I get why they do it, but everybody's got a very specific time slot. Mm-hmm. One of my big things is that a presentation should take as long as it takes to tell people what they need to know, and then you stop.
Okay, so with podcasters, they're famous. Everything has to be 18 minutes kind of thing. They've come up with this magic figure of 18 minutes. And then you've got the NLP set that say if you have to give information for 20 minutes before then for things to kind of sink in.
I think it's, you know what I'm going to say about the NLP lot, don't you? If they bother to get the research behind that, they know that 20 minutes is not where it's at. You take as long as it takes to get the message over, and then you stop. Some things I can get over in 10 minutes. Other things I can take an hour over, because that's how quickly or how slowly rather, my audience can absorb things. There's no point in doing if my audience needs an hour, there is no point in doing 45 minutes, because that's 45 minutes wasted.
Right.
On the other hand, if my audience can get it in 10 minutes, there's no point in doing 45, because that's 35 minutes wasted. So you look at the topic, you look at your audience, and you go, how long is that going to take? That's how long you use. If that means everybody goes into the coffee break early, hurrah.
You're the best thing since sliced bread. Yeah.
Nobody ever made themselves unpopular by finishing early.
I think that's the problem, is that actually people feel that people get their topics within 20 minutes, but because they've got a 45-minute slot, they've then filibust. And that's when you kind of start losing people, I guess.
And fairly soon, I'm going to suggest wrapping this up, because people, if they watched it, they now know the 3 steps. It's physical, intellectual, emotional. Those are the 3 steps. There's nothing more to add to that. We can go on and we can start making anecdotes about that, and we can answer questions about that and all that kind of thing. But if we're essential bit is done. Absolutely. If we're talking about the thing that we need to do, that's kind of it. If you see what I mean.
Okay. Yeah. Well, has anybody else got any questions? I know
Carson finished early and nearly got the sack. When I say that you can't make yourself unpopular by finishing early, that's a metaphor. I don't take that too literally, because if you finish too early, the conference organisers go absolutely apoplectic because they've got a very strict timetable to keep to. But yeah, you're right. The students loved it, because if you say what needs to be said, then that's it. Everything else is just padding.
Mm. understand that.
So that's it. Done. Finished. Nothing more to be said. Unless anyone's got any questions that they want me to go into, we'll call it quits, I guess. Any questions from anybody? Speak now.
Quality blab, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. As they say in wedding ceremonies, like, speak now or forever hold your peace. No, that's it. Okay. There was one thing I would like to add, though, which is that if people want to get in contact, the place to go is presentationgenius.info, and we can carry on chatting till the cows come home via presentationgenius.info, or Twitter is @presentations. I'm more than happy to carry on talking to people, but there's no point in wasting everybody's time now.
Not a problem. Not a problem. Well, I'm going to say goodbye and thank you.
You're very, very welcome. I hope folks have enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
All right.